There's a story I keep coming back to over and over again. I was going to apologize for repeating it now until I realized we just celebrated Simchat Torah, the holiday that's all about repeating the stories we love. We finish the Torah and immediately start over again, because with each retelling, there's always something new to learn. There's an episode of the famous radio show This American Life. A single father, Matt, has a 9-year-old daughter named Rosie who keeps asking him questions. She's in her why phase. Why can't I have my own room? Why can't I have a yard? Can I have a cookie? This poor guy is just trying to get some work done, so he tells her, Rosie, why don't you take a few minutes and write all your questions down and I'll answer them one by one. So she does. He expected she'd come back with 3 questions and a doodle of a rabbit. Instead, she comes back with 3 handwritten pages with 50 of life's most fundamental, unanswerable questions. Like, what is life? Why? Where do we go when we die? Explain. And this gem, which I want to focus on today, time. Why? Explain. Matt's an English professor, so he throws all his intellectual weight behind this new passion project. He composes a manifesto for his kid. He spends weeks and sometimes months on a single question. He does research. He quotes Kierkegaard and Faulkner. Here's an excerpt from his answer to time. Why? Explain. He writes, and one of my favorite stories is by a guy named William Faulkner. There was a daddy who gives his kid a watch and says, I give you this watch, not that you might remember time, but so that you might forget it for a little while. Matt writes, I can only tell you that time is me turning and turning while the world is turning around a star that turns around a center that turns around the whole time. Among all the other things and the little turning animals and all the little turning worlds, there's me trying to turn to you. When Matt finally completes his masterwork and hands it to Rosie, she doesn't react the way he'd hoped. There's no celebration, no great cheers or thank yous. In fact, she's actually disappointed. But I answered all your questions, her father tells her. Isn't that what you wanted? Rosie now answers her father's question. She turns to him and says, I just wanted to spend time with you. I can imagine Matt's heart breaking in this moment. She had come up with the hardest questions she could think of just so her father would have to close his computer and talk to her. Instead, he locked himself in a room and buried himself in even more work. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The most iconic words ever written, worth repeating over and over again, because there's always something new to learn. The 15th century Spanish rabbi who went by Akedat Yitzchak notices that the Hebrew word bara, created, comes before God's name, Elohim. In English, the verse is literally, in the beginning created God, the heavens and the earth. He explains that as human beings, we tend to introduce ourselves by saying our names first, then we talk about what it is that we do. But God is intentionally doing the opposite here. First, God tells us what God does, and only then do we learn God's name. Bereshit bara Elohim. Akedat Yitzchak writes, this teaches us that we can recognize God by God's deeds and wonders. It is they that testify to God's existence. The Torah began with, in the beginning, created, and only then did it state God, because there is no way to recognize God except through that which God created. Through the mightiness of creation, we can appreciate the might of the Creator. Direct knowledge of the divine is impossible. When Moses asks to see God's face, God says, you cannot see my face and live. The same seems true of angels. as well. When Samson's father, Samson is like the Jewish Hercules, asks the angel who foretells of Samson's impending birth for his name, the angel replies, Lama zeh tish'al lishmi v'hu feli. Why do you ask for my name, seeing as it is hidden? The commentator Rashi explains that angels receive a new name whenever they receive a new mission. When the assignment changes, so does their name. When it comes to God, when it comes to angels, work, creation, is how we come to know the Creator. Like an artist who leaves her signature in the painting itself, if you want to see God's face, if you want to know God's name, look at God's work. We read in the book of Psalms, Hashamayim misaprim kavod el u'ma'aseh yadav magid harakia. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims God's handiwork. I think that's such a beautiful, powerful idea. And I think it's harmful when we apply that principle, meant only for God and angels, to ourselves. Unlike divine beings, we come to know one another directly, not only through our work, not only through what it is that we do, but simply through time spent together in relationship. Matt, the father from the story, poured himself into work, wanting to leave an indelible impact on his daughter that way. In the process, he learned that all his daughter wanted was his time. When we were studying together for your bat mitzvah, Liel, you asked me a question about time in Bereshit, your Torah portion. Could the world really have been created in 6 days with God resting on the seventh, when we know that the world is 4.5 billion years old? There are lots of ways to try to answer that great question, but I have a new one this year, which is that parents experience time differently than their children do. And I imagine the same holds true for God and God's creation. In another psalm, Moses writes, Ki elef shanim be'einecha kayom etmol ki ya'avor ve'ashmura v'layla. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. Days, weeks, years might seem long for a baby, for a growing child. Teenagedom alone feels like 1 billion years. So you have that to look forward to. But to parents who are all of a sudden celebrating their daughter's bat mitzvah, and grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles, great-grandparents, where did the time go? Sunrise, sunset, vayerev, vayiboker, there was evening and there was morning, 1 billion years, like a day, a passing shadow. Or to return yet again to that opening story, I give you this watch, not that you might remember time, but so that you might forget it for a little while. I can only tell you that time is me turning and turning while the world is turning around a star that turns around a center that turns around the whole time. Among all the other things and the little turning animals and all the little turning worlds, there's me trying to turn to you. Do you want to know what the Jewish answer is to time? Why? Explain. On the seventh day, God rests. Shabbat. As if to say, there is something more precious than work, even sacred work. Because all that work would be in vain. Our world would be incomplete if not for sacred time. Time to recognize that we are not only defined by what we do, but by who we are simply by virtue of being alive. It's what Rabbi Hal said about being created b'tselem Elohim. Recipients of this most magnificent gift. We read this week that God creates humanity b'tselem Elohim in the image of God, intrinsically valuable irrespective of what we do, carrying each of us within ourselves a spark of the divine. Shabbat is time to recognize that while everything is constantly turning and turning and turning in space, our sacred task, so much harder than it seems, is to turn toward one another in time, because we don't have enough of it. Or we do, but it passes like a watch in the night. We're at the end now of another high holiday cycle. Sukkot, a festival pilgrimage holiday where God calls us to appear in Jerusalem and be joyful. What was all of this about? For one thing, maybe God just wants time with us. How many times when reading about the holidays do we read, "Do not work at your occupations"? Like Rosie, God wants us to turn off the computer for a minute and just talk. God gives us this watch of Shabbat, high holidays, and festivals, the Jewish calendar, not that we might remember time, but so that we might forget it for a little while and bask in the joy of creation. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. And then took time to reflect and see that it was good. Very good. Shabbat shalom.